We're back and we're talking about all the mistakes you need to avoid in the early part of your regular fantasy football season. Now, if you don't avoid these mistakes, you could end up in trouble down the road later this season or even later on in your dynasty. And if you're watching this, you've already made it through most of the first week, if not all of the first week of your fantasy football season. A lot has happened already, but it's important not to get too carried away. And before I get carried away and start talking about all my points I have to bring to you today, be sure to like the video, comment down below some mistakes you need to avoid to start the fantasy football season. And of course, one of the biggest mistakes to avoid is failing to join our Patreon Discord community, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial. Check it out. Join in on the fun of a bunch of like-minded individuals like yourself that just love fantasy football. But with that said, all the promo in the books, let's get to the content you came for. First and foremost, at the top of my list today is avoiding knee-jerk reactions. It's very easy to get carried away in week one or any of the early weeks of the season. There's a lot of info to digest. There's a lot of expectations we had on players coming into the year. But one thing to keep in mind is that early on in the regular season, teams are still finding their groove. Offenses aren't going to be gelled together yet. Roles aren't going to be fleshed out. Offenses just don't have that same polish that they'll have in weeks 5 or 6. It's a long offseason for these guys too, and even elite athletes take time getting back up to game speed. So we need to take things with a grain of salt and dive deeper every chance we get and look for things that the box score does not tell us. Look for more context beyond that box score. Moving on to my next point here is don't buy all of the hype you're seeing in week one. It was a very exciting week one, like I mentioned. There were plenty of players that popped off like we didn't expect, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is going to continue or that it's realistic to expect that to be the case. Just looking at Thursday Night Football, Baltimore versus Kansas City. You have two prime examples of players who are now getting or going to get an incredible amount of hype over the next week. That being Xavier Worthy and Isaiah Likely. But when you look at these players, there's maybe some red flags or context that needs to be taken into consideration before wanting to buy in, selling, etc. You get it. There's more to digest besides the excitement. Looking at Xavier Worthy's stat line, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 47 yards, touchdown to go along with that, along with 1 rush for a 21-yard rushing touchdown. So he had 3 touches, 4 opportunities. It's hard for me to really buy into that over the course of time. I understand he's still a rookie. His touches are going to be limited in general. And this is a really good offense. And if you want a somewhat volatile piece in any offense, at least it's a really good one. This is super exciting, but 4 opportunities over the course of the entire game, including targets, is just not super fantasy viable. On top of that, I'm interested to see how his role develops once Hollywood Brown comes back into the fold, for good or bad. I was a big fan of Xavier Worthy coming out and in this process, a player who I can definitely note concerns with. And I can certainly say I'm excited about this, but it's one of those cases where if I have him, cool, but I'm still heavily concerned about throwing him into a lineup. I don't necessarily want to go buy him anywhere, especially now being a rookie with some production under his belt, 2 touchdowns, nothing to scoff at. 47 yards is fine. A 21-yard rushing touchdown, great. His price just went up, and now he's even less accessible than he was. Then you look at Isaiah Likely. 12 targets, 9 receptions, 111 yards, and a touchdown. These are the numbers I'd expect from Mark Andrews. But again, I think there's a lot of context that needs to be addressed here before we get all excited about Isaiah Likely and down on Mark Andrews. I 100% expect Isaiah Likely to be involved or continue to be involved in this offense as what looks to be a pseudo wide receiver 2 in the offense. Ultimately, I think Mark Andrews will bounce back, and I don't think we should be super quick to flip these two saying, oh, Isaiah Likely is the new one, Mark Andrews the new number 2. Not saying that everybody is going to think like that, but I know that's going to creep in the back of people's minds, especially if we continue to see a slow start from Mark Andrews. But we just need to take a breath. Mark Andrews suffered a broken fibula last season, and it sounds to me like the offseason rehab was pretty brutal. So I'd expect it'll take him a little longer, even longer than normal, to get back up to game speed. Plus, if you were watching the game, that offensive line of Baltimore was in rough shape through the entire matchup. It doesn't help that the Chiefs' defensive line is pretty good at forcing pressure to begin with, but then you have that beat up line. Mark Andrews has to step in, chip a defender before he takes off on his route, or it just gets left in on blocking plays, doesn't even end up running a route. It's just a bad mix of everything going on against Mark Andrews. And while that line is getting in sync, while Mark Andrews is getting back up to speed, I do think it's probably going to be a slow start to the season for him. In the meantime, Isaiah Likely is going to be very fun, but I'm not going to sit here and say Isaiah Likely is going to be the new number 1 tight end while Mark Andrews is getting paid $16 million a year. Ultimately, I think Mark Andrews will be fine. It's just going to take time. Be patient. Don't sweat it right now. If you have Isaiah Likely, I'd say he's probably a fine start at this point. If you have Mark Andrews, man, good balls on you for being willing to start him. I am not. That said, moving on to this next point, don't sell all the hype either. At least not just for the sake of selling. At the end of the day, there's hype for a reason. We got into this discussion with Puka Nacua last year, a guy who started off the season just incredible. And unfortunately, a lot of people sold him early on in the season for probably less than what they could get him now. I'd call it a very high likelihood, actually. And while I don't love to dance around 100th percentile outcomes like Puka Nacua is, being that he was a guy who relatively out of nowhere, late round draft capital, came into the season with a veteran in front of him, obviously Cooper Kupp, not healthy to start the year, but still there was that expectation when he was drafted that Cooper Kupp would be ahead of him. But obviously, Puka Nacua blew up. We need to get out of the habit of when the second a player increases in value, even incrementally, we have to sell that player ASAP. There's definitely times where this makes sense, but in general, if you want to turn the corner, compete at some point, you need to just sit with your roster as is instead of continuously looking to turn your roster over. If you do end up selling at this point in the season, selling on hype, whatever the case is, I hope you're at least making an upgrade to a more solidified player at that position or finding help within another position group and upgrading. I don't want to just sell to sell. Remember to make productive trades. Before you make a trade, ask yourself, what does this do for my team? Why is this good for my team? We need to stop selling just to sell. With all the hype that comes in, good or bad, with all the hype that comes in, we have to do our due diligence to vet that hype and determine if it's worthwhile and has the possibility of being sustainable. That's the key. All hype aside, moving on to the next point, it's a long season. You need to remember that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's important not to blow your entire wad early in the year if you're buying into players in an attempt to compete now. There's football now, so there shouldn't be any excuse for boredom trading. If you're really that bored, go join in on the pick'em action at Sleeper or Underdog using promo code REWIND for a deposit match. Or better yet, check out patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial. Come hang out with us, talk some trades, talk values, talk expectations and projections for a free week. Shameless plugs aside, if you're focused on productive trades, this should be easier for you to manage. Make sure you're trading with a purpose and not just because new shiny rookie good. Injuries will happen, players will underperform, you will need help later, I promise you that, one way or another. And having assets to move when the time comes will allow you to address those concerns when you need to. Just remember, slow and steady wins the race. The beginning of the regular season is very hard. There's a lot of unknown to start the year. Kind of like we discussed in point number 1. Don't give up on your season after a few bad weeks to start your year. Don't just throw your hands up in the air and say, well, there's always next year. Not yet, at least. Learn to recalibrate. See what needs fixing and what can be fixed. I know personally that one of my biggest struggles is setting the best possible lineup. Part of the problem is I have too many good players. Shameless hat tip. So I have to make that effort to do as much research as I can on the matchups and whatnot to ensure that I'm setting the best possible lineup, especially after we're a few weeks into the season and there's some recent data to back up what I'm thinking, why X player might be better than Y player, whatever the case is. If you can find out what your struggle is, what's keeping you away from being a good team this year, and decipher why your team is doing so poorly early, you might be able to find the solution early enough to salvage your season. And keep in mind where the rest of the league is at too. You might not be that worse for wear if you go 1-4 if the rest of your league is kind of struggling too. And maybe there's only one really good team to start the year. Now, if you're off to a bad start and you weren't really planning on making a strong push this year anyway, it may be time to dial back and look forward to next year. Because if you're struggling now, the season will get harder. As much as things clear up, it does become a bit of a war of attrition where you need assets to outlast the war. So if you're struggling in the first quarter of the season due to lack of depth, unproductive players, whatever the case is, and you weren't that hopeful to be a competitive team this year to begin with, might be time to pack it in, start rebuilding a little early. Staying active in your league is always going to be important. And in my opinion, early season waivers are some of the most important waivers that you'll see all season. There will definitely be guys that pop up here and there throughout the course of the season, but this is probably the freshest your waiver wire will be all year with all the question marks and unknowns that are still out there. So be active. See what's out there that can help your squad or be used in trade deals later. This goes if you're competitive or rebuilding. You should still be active on your waiver wire. Obviously, this is more fitting for certain leagues than others. I know I'm in a few deep leagues where my waiver wires really aren't that fruitful because I have 40-man rosters. It's a 12-team league. There's a huge taxi squad as well. Waivers just aren't exciting. But I'm in plenty of other leagues too where it is a little shallower and there is a little bit of excitement week to week, especially early on in the season with what's out there. And I'll admit this is another fault of mine. I'm better early on in the season when things are a little bit more exciting, but I can admit that I pay a little bit less attention every week on waivers throughout the season. And keep in mind, if you're going to be adding players, you probably need to be cutting players as well to keep your roster in line. It's important to be diligent here with what players get to stay on your roster, and that can depend on what kind of build your roster is in right now. If you're rebuilding, stick with younger upside. Don't sweat cutting inconsequential depth upside that competing teams just aren't likely to trade for. If you're competitive now, it may make more sense to prioritize points now versus chasing upside stashes. An easy way to find players that are cuttable on your roster: if non-consequential veteran players aren't performing early on in the season, they're not getting reps, they're not putting up points, they're not getting targets, whatever the case is, they're not getting run in the backfield, also known as guys who have done little to nothing for no one throughout the course of their career already, you can probably cut them if you find a valuable addition on waivers. And last but certainly not least, do not get impatient with rookies. Rookies are so fun and exciting. I get it. We have such high expectations for them the second we hit the draft button on them. Seeing them hit the field the first time with the hope that they'll soon fulfill whatever prophecy we made for them. Unfortunate fact of the matter is rookies tend to take time to develop. There's obviously exceptions to that rule every year, but it's important to temper your expectations for rookie players and not kick them to the curb the second they don't score 12 points in week 1. If you're a rebuilding team, it's especially okay to just let these guys develop and not panic unless you're seeing little to no usage. If you're contending and maybe you need more reliable points in your lineup or on your bench even, try checking for undervalued vets to buy where you can, not necessarily at the cost of your rookie, but other assets you may have. Or you could look to lump these rookies into larger package deals to try to buy from rebuilding teams that may have a more established top tier veteran who's been in the league a couple years, who's more into their productive prime. I just don't want to see anyone getting into the habit of shipping off rookies for future draft picks to just re-roll because it's not the perfect start. It's not a Jamar Chase start to their career. It's something actually realistic. Again, if you're trading rookies, don't just trade them away, sell them for the sake of selling to get future picks next year. Use them as a launch pad to get to a better position player of the same position group or help elsewhere on your roster to alleviate for injuries, whatever the case may be. Again, going back to the concept of productive trading. With all that said, that is 7 mistakes to avoid early on in your fantasy football season. Don't be making these or you might fall into trouble later on in this season or later on in your dynasty. Be sure you're liking the video, commenting down below some of your favorite mistakes to avoid, maybe mistakes you've made in the past or you've seen other managers make. And let me know what shocked you the most in week 1. And don't forget to head on over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial. Come hang out with all of us in the Discord, the community, all the members here on the channel. We appreciate the heck out of you guys. But with all that said, all the promo in the books, I am going to get the heck on out of here. I will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.